You think profound psychological transformation requires years of therapy or spiritual practice. Maslow discovered something that contradicts everything conventional psychology teaches about change. In his research on self-actualized individuals, he found that certain people experience what he called peak experiences, temporary states of consciousness so powerful they fundamentally reorganize their entire perception of reality in moments rather than years. These psychologically mature people were having spontaneous experiences that changed everything while observers had no idea what was happening inside them. The most remarkable part? Maslow identified that peak experiences aren't random mystical events. They follow specific psychological patterns and appear more frequently in people at certain developmental levels. It's a documented phenomenon that Western psychology barely understands, but that represents some of the most transformative moments available in human consciousness. And recognizing the signs that you're having or about to have a peak experience means understanding that your brain is temporarily accessing a mode of perception that most people never experience. What feels like everything changing isn't delusion. It's consciousness operating at a capacity that ordinary awareness filters out. Not every intense experience is a peak experience in Maslow's sense. There's a critical difference between emotional highs, drug-induced states, or manic episodes, and what Maslow documented as genuine peak experiences. He observed that most people having powerful emotional moments, falling in love, achieving goals, religious ecstasy, were experiencing intensified versions of normal consciousness, not qualitatively different states. But the pattern he documented in peak experiences was fundamentally different. These were temporary shifts where the normal structure of consciousness, the sense of separate self, the experience of time, the subject-objective vision, temporarily dissolved or radically altered. People weren't just feeling intensely, they were perceiving differently, thinking differently, existing differently for the duration of the experience. This wasn't pathology, intoxication, or delusion. This was consciousness accessing modes of functioning that exist as human potential but rarely activate. What appears as mystical or supernatural from outside is actually well-documented psychology from inside. Your brain temporarily releasing certain filters and constraints, allowing perception and cognition to operate in ways that feel like reality itself has changed. Real peak experiences, according to Maslow's research, leave lasting impact even though they're temporary, fundamentally altering how you understand yourself in reality. In this video, I'm going to reveal what Maslow discovered about peak experiences, the temporary psychological shifts that can change your entire relationship of reality based on his studies of self-actualized individuals and his own documented experiences. You'll discover the specific characteristics that distinguish genuine peak experiences from ordinary intense emotions, why these experiences happen more frequently to psychologically developed people, and what they reveal about consciousness capacities most people never access. These are insights from humanistic psychology and contemporary neuroscience that explain the mechanisms behind experiences that mystics have described for millennia, but that science is only beginning to understand. By the end, you'll recognize whether you've had peak experiences and what they indicate about your psychological development. This isn't a video promoting drugs, spiritual practices, or techniques to force peak experiences. This is psychology explaining spontaneous consciousness shifts that happen to certain people under specific conditions. This video is for people who've had moments where reality seemed to shift, where ordinary perception dissolved into something else, where everything made sense in ways they can't quite explain afterward. If you've experienced time stopping, boundaries between self and world dissolving, or a profound recognition that everything is somehow perfect despite evidence to the contrary, you're about to understand what actually happened in your brain and consciousness. But critical warning, peak experiences cannot be forced, and attempting to manufacture them often prevents them. If you're ready to understand the psychology behind consciousness shifts that feel like reality itself transforming, keep watching. Think about a moment in your life when something shifted so completely that ordinary description fails. Maybe you were in nature and suddenly the boundary between you and the landscape dissolved. There's just seeing, no separate seer. Maybe you were creating something and time disappeared completely. Hours passed like minutes. You and the work were one thing. Maybe you experienced grief so profound that it cracked something open and suddenly you understood death, life, love in ways that felt like direct knowing rather than thinking. That quality of experience where normal consciousness temporarily gives way to something else is what Maslow spent years studying and documenting. He found these weren't rare mystical events happening to special people. They were natural capacities of human consciousness that activated under specific conditions, and they appeared far more frequently in psychologically healthy, self-actualized individuals. The psychological weight of a genuine peak experience is that it doesn't just feel different in the moment. It permanently alters your baseline understanding of what consciousness can do and what reality might actually be. You cannot have a peak experience and return completely unchanged because you've directly perceived that the normal way you experience reality is one mode among several possible, and the other modes reveal things a normal mode filters out. This is what Maslow meant when he said peak experiences were self-validating. They carry their own sense of truth that needs no external confirmation. Maslow's hierarchy helps explain why peak experiences occur more frequently at higher developmental levels. At the first 4 levels, physiological needs, safety, love, and belonging, esteem, consciousness is organized around managing deficiency and threat. Your perceptual system is constantly scanning for what's wrong, what's missing, what needs to be fixed or obtained. This creates a contracted, defensive mode of awareness that's highly functional for survival, but limited in range. Peak experiences rarely occur from these levels because the psychological conditions aren't conducive. You're too defended, too focused on problems, too identified with a separate self that needs protection. But at the 5th level, self-actualization, something fundamental shifts. You've satisfied the deficiency needs, so consciousness is no longer organized primarily around threat and lack. This creates what Maslow called being cognition, a mode of perception that's receptive rather than defensive, appreciative rather than evaluative, present rather than fixated on past or future. Being cognition is the psychological soil in which peak experiences grow. Here's the insight that explains everything. Peak experiences are what happens when being cognition intensifies to the point where the normal structure of self temporarily dissolves. Your defenses drop completely. Your self-boundaries become permeable, time-based thinking pauses, and consciousness experiences reality directly rather than to filter of self-concern. This is why Maslow found peak experiences cluster in self-actualized people, not because they're special, but because they've completed the developmental work that makes their consciousness available for these temporary dissolutions of normal structure. The more psychologically developed you are, the less defended you are, and the less defended you are, the more accessible peak experiences become. But they remain spontaneous. You cannot force them, only create conditions where they might occur. William James, considered the founder of American psychology, studied what he called varieties of religious experience in the early 1900s. He documented experiences that match exactly what Maslow later called peak experiences, temporary states where people reported feeling unified with everything, perceiving profound truth, experiencing intense joy or peace, and having their entire worldview permanently altered. James found these experiences across all religions and in secular contexts, suggesting they were psychological phenomena rather than evidence for specific spiritual beliefs. His work showed that human consciousness has capacity for these shifts regardless of cultural conditioning. The neuroscientist Andrew Newberg studied the brain during peak experiences in mystical states using neuroimaging. His research found consistent patterns. Decreased activity in the parietal lobe, which maintains sense of separate self and spatial boundaries. Increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, associated with focused attention. And changes in the temporal lobe, associated with sense of time. His work showed that peak experiences have neural correlates. They're not supernatural, but reflect specific patterns of brain activity that produce qualitatively different conscious states. The psychologist Abraham Pine studied what triggers peak experiences and found common contexts: nature exposure, artistic creation or appreciation, deep intimacy, physical exertion, childbirth, near-death experiences, and moments of profound beauty or recognition. His research showed these experiences weren't random. They occurred when certain conditions lowered normal ego defenses and allowed consciousness to operate differently. The physicist and philosopher Fritjof Capra documented similarities between descriptions of peak experiences and descriptions of reality from quantum physics. The interconnection of everything, the observer affecting the observed, the fundamental unity beneath apparent separation. His work suggested peak experiences might be perceiving aspect of reality that normal consciousness filters out rather than creating illusions. Insider knowledge from consciousness research reveals what Maslow intuited. Peak experiences represent consciousness temporarily accessing modes of functioning that are always potentially available, but usually inhibited by psychological defenses and perceptual habits built for survival rather than truth. But here's what Maslow discovered about the specific characteristics that define genuine peak experiences, and understanding these helps distinguish them from other intense states. The first characteristic he identified is ego transcendence or self-transcendence. During peak experience, your normal sense of being a separate self temporarily dissolves or expands dramatically. You might experience yourself as part of everything rather than separate from it, or the boundary between inner and outer might become permeable or disappear. This isn't loss of consciousness, you're often hyperconscious, but loss of a usual self-boundary. You're aware but not as a separate entity observing reality from behind your eyes. The second characteristic is what Maslow called being perception or be-perception. Your normal mode of perception is evaluative, constantly judging things as good/bad, useful/useless, threatening/safe. During peak experience, this evaluative mode stops and you perceive things as they are without judgment or self-reference. A tree isn't beautiful or potential lumber. It's just utterly itself, and that isness is somehow perfect and complete. This creates what people describe as seeing reality directly for the first time. The third characteristic is time and space alteration. Normal consciousness exists in clock time, past, present, future flowing linearly. During peak experience, this stops. People report feeling outside time entirely, or that time has become meaningless, or that everything is happening in an eternal now. Space can similarly shift. Distances feeling different, locations blurring, or sense of being everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The fourth characteristic is what Maslow called integration and unity. Contradictions that normally seem important dissolve. Life and death, self and other, part and whole. These dualities become unified or revealed as different aspects of single reality. People consistently report feeling that everything makes sense, that it's all one thing, that apparent separation is superficial over fundamental unity. The fifth characteristic is passive/receptive orientation. During peak experience, you're not making anything happen. It's happening to you, or rather through you. The normal sense of being the actor, the doer, the agent drops away, and you're simply present to what's occurring. This creates feeling of grace or gift. Something is being given rather than achieved. The sixth characteristic Maslow documented is positive effect but beyond ordinary pleasure. Peak experiences involve intense positive emotion, but it's qualitatively different from normal pleasure or happiness. People describe it as joy, bliss, rapture, or profound peace that's not dependent on external circumstances. It's not pleasure from getting what you want. It's something more like recognizing perfection of what is. The seventh characteristic is self-validation and intrinsic value. Peak experiences carry their own sense of truth and worth. You don't need anyone to confirm what you experienced or tell you it mattered. It's self-evidently significant. This is why people having peak experiences rarely doubt them even when they can't explain them. The experience validates itself. The eighth characteristic is what Maslow called disorientation in time and space after the experience. When you return to normal consciousness, there's often confusion about how much time passed, where you are, or how to re-engage with ordinary reality. The transition back can feel jarring because you're moving between fundamentally different modes of consciousness. The ninth characteristic is lasting effects. Even though peak experiences are temporary, lasting minutes to hours, occasionally days, they produce permanent changes in how you understand yourself in reality. People consistently report that one peak experience taught them more than years of ordinary experience, gave them certainty about things they'd only believed conceptually, or permanently reduced their fear of death. The 10th characteristic Maslow identified is ineffability, difficulty putting the experience into words. Language feels inadequate because it's built for describing separate things in time and space, and peak experiences transcend those categories. People resort to poetry, metaphor, or silence because direct description fails. These 10 characteristics cluster together in genuine peak experiences. You might not have all 10 in every experience, but the more of these present, the more likely you had what Maslow was documenting rather than just an intense emotional state or altered state from external causes. The transformation that occurs when you have a genuine peak experience creates permanent shifts in your psychological functioning and worldview even after normal consciousness returns. Remember the anxiety about death, the sense that your existence is fundamentally separate and vulnerable, the feeling that life's meaning comes from external achievement. Peak experiences often dissolve these permanently or at least weaken them dramatically because you've directly perceived something that contradicts them. Your fear of death typically decreases after peak experiences because you've temporarily experienced consciousness as something that doesn't feel located in your individual form. It feels like what you are is larger than the body and personality that will die. This isn't belief imposed for comfort. It's direct perception that shifts your relationship to mortality. Your sense of meaning transforms from something you must create or achieve to something that's inherent in existence itself. After peak experiences, people consistently report feeling that life is meaningful in itself rather than needing to accomplish specific things to justify existence. Your relationships often deepen because you experience a fundamental connectedness of everything, which makes authentic intimacy feel more possible and separation feel more superficial than it used to. Your values typically shift toward what Maslow called being values: truth, beauty, goodness, unity, and away from deficiency values: status, security, achievement, control. You care less about what you lack and more about expressing what you are. Your creativity often increases because peak experiences show you that you can access states where the normal self-consciousness that inhibits creativity temporarily dissolves. Even your baseline anxiety usually decreases because you've experienced states where anxiety doesn't exist, and knowing those states are possible creates psychological flexibility that reduces how much normal anxiety controls you. Now here's where everything Maslow discovered reveals its practical significance, and where understanding peak experiences transforms from interesting psychology to something that might change your life. Peak experiences cannot be forced, manufactured, or achieved through technique. This is crucial. Maslow found that the more you try to have one, the less likely it becomes because trying is an ego activity that reinforces exactly the self-structure that needs to dissolve for peak experience to occur. But you can create conditions that make peak experiences more likely if they're going to happen. The first condition is completion of psychological development through self-actualization work. You need to have done enough healing, integration, and growth that your consciousness isn't constantly defending against threats or managing deficiency needs. This is why therapy, shadow work, trauma healing, and authentic relationship building aren't bypasses. They're foundation. The second condition is regular exposure to beauty, nature, art, or situations that inspire awe. Peak experiences happen more frequently when you're encountering something that temporarily overwhelms your normal categorizing mind. The third condition is cultivating being cognition through practices like meditation, contemplative prayer, or simply learning to perceive without immediately judging and evaluating. You're training consciousness to operate in receptive mode rather than defensive mode. The fourth condition is solitude and reduced stimulation. Peak experiences rarely happen in busy, distracting environments because consciousness needs space to shift modes. The fifth condition is surrender, control, and acceptance of what is. Peak experiences often occur when you stop fighting reality and open to it completely. In grief, in love, in recognition that you cannot control what matters most. If you create these conditions without attachment to outcome, you're making yourself available for peak experiences if consciousness is ready to have them. But attachment to having one prevents it because attachment is ego activity. The paradox is that peak experiences come when you're not seeking them, but you prepare the psychological soil where they might grow. Some people never have them. Maslow estimated perhaps 50% of people have at least one in their lifetime, but they're far more common in self-actualized individuals. If you've had them, you know exactly what Maslow was describing. If you haven't, understanding what they are helps you recognize them if they occur and understand that they're natural psychological phenomena rather than supernatural events requiring religious interpretation. The significance of peak experiences in Maslow's work is that they provided empirical evidence for consciousness capacities that mystical traditions had described but that science had dismissed. They show that human awareness can temporarily operate in modes radically different from normal consciousness, that these modes reveal aspects of reality filtered out by ordinary perception, and that brief exposure to these states can permanently transform someone's psychological functioning. This is why Maslow considered them crucial to understanding human potential. They showed what consciousness is capable of when developmental work removes the psychological obstacles to its full functioning. In the next video, I'm going to reveal what Maslow discovered about the stage beyond self-actualization that he called transcendence, where peak experiences become so frequent they're almost baseline consciousness, and what that reveals about the furthest reaches of human psychological development. Until then, if you had experiences matching what I've described, you're not crazy. You've temporarily accessed consciousness capacities that are real but rarely activated. And if you haven't, understanding they exist expands your sense of what human awareness might be capable of beyond ordinary perception. Subscribe if you want to understand the complete psychology of consciousness, peak experiences, and how far human development can actually go according to Maslow's final research.